Hello, students and graduates. Welcome to PhD Lounge, the podcast in which PhDs have a drink and talk about their research topics. I'm your host Luis, and we have the first late night talk with PhDs of 2025. But before I introduce you to these guests, I want to thank you for tuning in to the last late night solo show where I talked about the issue of PhD productivity tools and hacks overwhelming your research and yourself. I stressed not only the problem of these tools and hacks, but also those that work well with you according to your personality and whether they fit within your budget. Moreover, here are some updates about PhD Lounge. While I said previously that I cannot mention about my future guest, who is a scholar from Tulane University and is launching a book to be released in the foreseeable future, I got an email from a publicist of Princeton University Press to not only tell me about that scholar, but also another one who is from Duke University in North Carolina and has also a book to be released. The publicist told me that this scholar from Duke is available for a future interview, and I'm thinking of making an invitation to join the PhD Lounge in the future, preferably after I submit my dissertation, in order to have time to write up the scripted questions. I must say that it is a great opportunity to have both scholars to increase my academic and industry network for future jobs, not only in the UK, but also overseas. And so I look forward for what's coming ahead to benefit PhD Lounge after having these two interviews, as well as this one that I'm going to introduce the following guests to you. They're all from Swansea University, doing PhDs in history, but they're looking at different periods of history. One guest looks at Greek Hagiography from Christian Late Antiquity and how it's a kind of sophisticated literature. That guest also talks about symbolic blackness and gender, using Mary of Egypt and Zosimus and Anthony as examples. If you're easily triggered by these topics, I recommend you to stop listening to the rest of the talk at any time. The second guest is talking about his PhD research on late antique rule in Hispania and the role of the Regnum Suevorum during the period when the Roman Empire was falling apart in the west and the barbarians took over. Galicia in modern-day northwest Spain is the main focus of his research. The third and final guest studies contemporary history, focusing on the late 18th and the first 3 decades of the 19th century, on female sexual deviancy and adultery during the boom of printed materials and reporting in England, i.e. during the Industrial Revolution, which includes a comparative literary analysis between adultery and deviancy acts of elite and non-elite women of that time frame. As well as their research, they shared their PhD experience and advice for doing one, and took part in other related activities, and a call for paper conference, which will happen between the 2nd and 4th of July at Swansea University, and whose abstract submission is until the 28th of February. The conference is called Apocalypsis Nunc, Apocalypse and Calamity in the Ancient World. So, students and graduates, get yourselves a drink, have a seat, and let's give a warm welcome to Bella Winton, Alec Dawson, and Ella Harford. Alec and Ella, thank you for accepting my invitation to join to the PhD Lounge. And we were previously talking about the AI. So, Alec, can you give us a bit of that context that you were talking about about AI and also about the Progress project, since it's quite an exclusive thing here in Swansea University.
Yeah, so I'll start with Progress first. So Progress is the Department of History, Heritage and Classics' PGR seminar series. It's chaired by myself and Louise Furs. And every week we have different sessions which are talking about all different aspects of academia, both from a postgraduate view, but also from a sort of more generic academic view as well.
Right.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, go on.
So later this month we're going to be having a roundtable discussion on AI and academia, specifically sort of the areas that are causing problems, but also benefits to the academic community as well.
Right. And it seems quite like that many of the students that we're talking about and using the AI, they say, "Oh, you shouldn't use the AI, otherwise it's going to be plagiarism." And saying, "Yeah, to an extent, you're right, but you need to have some brains to use the AI, and you gotta realize that they say, for example, ChatGPT, they say on the bottom of the website, they say, this is a generative description, so it may make mistakes." We say, "Okay, I don't care. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?" And just like a preview for the next seminar series.
Yeah, I mean, so I think plagiarism is obviously a difficult topic to discuss, but I think, generally speaking, the way AI tends to work, at least the outcomes or whatever you input, or whatever question you want to ask, in 99% of the time will probably be an original response, because obviously everyone asks a different question. But where the AI draws the information from, that's where plagiarism can occur. So obviously if a undergraduate student wanted to use AI in his essay to answer a particularly difficult question or something that he's got absolutely no idea about, then obviously that's going to be problematic, because they're going to start getting a completely AI generated essay or something like that potentially might draw on different articles or books or volumes that this undergraduate student might have never actually read before. But at the same time, some of the AI generated essays and things like that have also been creating sources that don't exist as well, to justify things that the AI itself is arguing, which obviously creates a whole different range of problems in these situations.
Yeah, my sister's had some experience with that. She's a trainee clinical psychologist, and people often look for references using AI, which I think is valid, being like, can you show me some material that's related to this? But then it also provides something they call like Frankenstein references, where it will be like a random title with a random name, random publisher, random. So it just kind of sews together all sorts of completely unrelated articles into one title, and then obviously you're like, well, you clearly haven't actually checked any of it.
Yeah, but I do also think that it reminds us when where I can state from my personal experience in the mid to late 2000s, where we would sort of create our own not our own system of AI, but in a manual side where. So you have to do something, a brief search about cancer. I say, okay, let's do some cancer, and then we didn't know what plagiarism was at the time. And then so I'm going to grab this source from this web page, and I'm going for another source, from another. And this was my manual AI at the time, and say, okay, so he plagiarized, but since he doesn't know how to research yet, okay, I'm going to give him a pass. So, and I think nowadays with AI and now it generally catches from everything, and I guess it's also a manipulation of the algorithm that does that. But I think as future academics, we're gonna outsmart them, because we do have also the Turnitin when we do our marking. So it's an AI based itself.
Yeah, something I've noticed in marking, it is really, really obvious when someone has used AI, like to the extreme, because it just feels very auto-generated. It doesn't have any nuance, so like it's not quite there yet. I think maybe it will be in the future, but for now I think we're okay.
Can you give an example? Can you give us an example? Since you're mocking now, but
it's quite difficult to put into words. Obviously the year group that the essays I mark come in is first year undergraduate, so you expect a certain standard, and when you find that it's almost like they're saying loads without saying anything. So it's just all very kind of general, vague comments that in another context would be absolutely fine and would be, fine, but it doesn't have the attention to detail that you get from when you actually analyse the text. I can't put it into better words than that at the minute, but it's just like a sense that you get from when you read.
It's so, very briefly, you can put, this is so annoying that this doesn't feel right to mark. So I'm putting a big zero. It
doesn't have a personality. You often find it's just very, yeah.
So who will be the first to sharing your journey before adventuring into your current PhD topics, and what led you to choose them?
You choose. You choose. Yes, you choose.
So just very briefly, as my listeners know already, I've chosen to study ancient cities and their art and architecture in the Middle East, otherwise known as the Near East in archaeological terms per se, to trying to find the sort of cultural demographics in terms of sharing and also mingle them. But in my view, it's not to create a sense of something new, as one of the post-colonial scholars, Babu, who I reference a lot, uses them. I'd say instead the continuation of all the cultures that were involved during their interaction, where they share one thing and then share the other one, and they reproduce in their own context, in their own environment. And so the East, for me, it was the main reason I chose it, because it was the place where many people interacted and made their trade. Hence the cross-cultural interaction, so per se. So now that I've done, who's the next?
I'll go. Sure.
So,
for me, I study Greek Late Antique Christian Hagiography, so saints' lives. I look at them as sophisticated literary narratives, which hasn't been done in any kind of great detail. Kind of a lot of things have drawn me to it, I suppose. I've always loved, reading, writing, kind of fiction books and things like that. So I've always been interested in how stories are written. I went to a very kind of conservative Christian school.
Right.
I didn't really fit in. I'm not really the conservative type.
Sure.
But I've always, and my kind of family background as well, like my dad used to be a Christian, like evangelical Christian missionary. But I'm also kind of ethnically Jewish, and my mum was raised Irish, kind of Roman Catholic. So I've had lots of kind of weird influences. And so kind of that, and then also kind of tied in with an interest in psychology, because like the cult of Christianity is kind of interesting. So all of those things have kind of come together for me to then look at kind of the cult of saints and literature from that period in this kind of way.
Cool.
Go on. Okay, you made the mistake of speaking.
So well done.
My PhD basically looks at sex and adultery amongst women and how that's represented in a variety of print culture, specifically from the late 18th to the early 19th century. So that's late 1700s to the early 1800s. So I use lots of materials like novels, trials, prints, things like that. And I guess it was kind of a springboard from my master's dissertation and my undergraduate. I always used to study sort of elite women and very much focus on case studies. So I think when I was approaching my PhD topic, I was looking for something to to like link that all together. And a lot of that was like to do with scandal in the press as well as like adultery. So I think that's kind of what drew me to that topic. So yeah.
Last but not least.
My PhD focuses on 5th century AD Spain and sort of governance in sort of post-Roman states. So I specifically look at the people known as the Suevi, and how they sort of took on the role of aspects of the Roman government in Spain in particular. And similarly to Ella, on my current research springboarded off of my MA dissertation as well, where I looked at the ethnogenesis of the Suevi and also of another barbarian people known as the Vandals as well. Yes, that's sort of where I've really gone on from.
So we do have different topics, research topic with the two of you having a close time period, as you've told me previously, and spanning more than 1,000 years later.
Yeah. Ella and I have similarities in that we look at women and gender. Alec and I have similarities in that it's both kind of late antique, but that's kind of it.
So we can say then it's a bit of a everything into a common everything in common, basically. So we have exploring women and exploring identity. I also touch upon a bit of identity, but in the cultural sense. And one of the things that you said about in one of your topics, that would include also your motives to travel abroad, right? Yeah. So how was the experience for each of you going to on site to explore something that is about your topic, and what memories that you bring here, and then you're trying to use them onto your thesis?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Well, as I tend to see it, the whole point of a presentation is to make your audience see something that they didn't see before, right? And hopefully in a profound way, because if it's just an easy announcement that's not difficult to explain, why not just send a simple email or write a short memo about it? So the whole point of making a presentation or preparing a larger piece of communication is to make your audience see something that they didn't see before. And that means that means a couple of steps that are immediately derived from that. First of all, you need clarity about what is that actually? What do I need them to see? And you'd be surprised to learn how few people, not exclusively, but particularly in the science community, yes, wouldn't be able to say that, to give a concise answer to that. So what is it that you actually want your audience to see? So, and once you've nailed that or have clarity for yourself what that is, you can ask the second question. So why don't they see it already? What do they see? What do they see that I don't? And what do they miss that I see already? And once you have that, you can kind of build a path between those 2 points. And the ultimate goal of a presentation is to lead them to what I would call the point of no return, which would probably coincide with that aha moment where you've told them everything that helps them really see what you wanted to make them see, where there's no going back for them because they've seen it in a way that they cannot unsee it anymore, and where it makes total sense because you've explained it in a way that makes sense, using words that they can understand, using images and metaphors that they are familiar with.
Yes, something that is more exactly. It's more something that they are more familiar with. Something that is more common as they've seen, whether on TV or on YouTube. Something, in a sense, it's more of a touristic point of view. It's kind of like when they go to an event, they're attending a speaker, and you feel like I'm a tourist here and I want to hear what you have to say. And then something comes up and they say something that sparks them and I say, aha, that's what I want to know. And so basically
and that is that is a great approach, and that is so starkly different to what most people do. So most people, when I ask them how they would go about preparing a presentation, they tell me similar things. They first of all, they start with a presentation that they've already given a couple of weeks ago, and then they fill up all the other details that have come up since, and so until they discover, whoa, that's way too much information for 25 minutes. And then they start cutting, and it's still too much. And so basically they have that problem of overwhelming their audience because there are so many things that are interesting and great and fascinating about my field, which makes sense. I mean, you're doing a PhD about it. You're researching 5 years on it. Of course, there's more interesting things to say about it than you've got time to say it.
Yes.
But that approach that you've outlined is a very different approach, where you basically turn that upside down and you don't even bother about all the things that you can say, but only ask yourself, what is that one thing that makes that tourist look over, come closer, and think to themselves, well, that is interesting. I want to know more about that.
Sure.
And so getting clarity and starting there. So what is that one thing? And often it's really literally one thing only.
For me, I think it was really useful to go to Greece and look at Orthodox Greek churches, because I think obviously all of the the events I write about, well, supposedly the narratives are dated between the 2nd and 7th centuries, so it's obviously quite a long time ago, and I think it can be difficult sometimes to really understand the physicality of religion at that point. It all feels a bit intangible. So for me, actually going to these places and looking at the churches and looking at the ruins and all the kind of artifacts that are left, it just really helped me to kind of contextualize my texts and kind of gave me new perspectives on things. And I mean, I will always take an opportunity to go to Greece, so I'm very lucky.
Did you have to learn Greek while you were there?
So because I know, weirdly, modern Greek has a lot of similarities to ancient Greek. So I know ancient Greek. Obviously, I don't speak it. No one does. But I was able to decode, I think, a lot of the modern Greek. So by the time when I got back from excavating last spring, by the time I left, I was able to kind of pick apart people's sentences and kind of understand what was going on. I have since been learning modern Greek because a lot of the people who actually do the digging, the excavating, they don't speak English. They're all local to, so like I excavate in Corinth, and they're all local to Corinth. Sure. And so I'd like to be able to actually talk to them because they have so much knowledge and so much experience. And at the minute, I don't know what they're saying. So
you couldn't bring Maria. The Greek Maria.
I'd love to bring Maria Economou, but unfortunately she has other plans.
How about you, Alec and Ella?
Okay, so I've done two main research trips. One was to the British Library and the other one was to the Lewis Walpole Library at Yale University in America. So my first trip to the British Library, that was very useful. I was looking at the trials for adultery there. I just took like loads of photos and sort of I had to sit where they could see me so they could see I wasn't like cheating or trying to steal the books or anything. So yeah, that was really good. My second trip to the British Library was actually not that long ago, about a month ago now, and that was really frustrating because they've since had a cyber attack. So they're still only half kind of up and running. So a lot of their manuscripts collection aren't accessible yet online, and you kind of have to go to like a member of staff there to see
that's frustrating.
You can access. So I only managed to access one trial for adultery document that time around, which was pretty annoying because luckily they had their rare books like system up and running, which is good, but that was literally the only thing I I could really access relating to my research. So yeah, but my research trip to Yale University was way more useful. I accessed lots of like printed materials there, which isn't necessarily available in the UK. So I thought it was like really cool. They had lots of like British collections, unusually in America.
That was going to be a question of mine.
And the British ones over there. I think it was mainly collated from like this guy called Lewis Walpole, who was a big collector of like British art and satirical prints. So a lot of it has ended up there. So
weird.
It's a bit strange, but a lot of it is there. And I guess Yale are quite a rich and big university as well, so they tend to like buy in a lot of the prints from here as well. Yeah.
Wow, that's really great.
Yeah.
I'm still waiting for Nigel to tell me when to go to Yale, because also there's the Museum of Dura Europos, where they were the main ones to excavate that Syrian city, and I'm still waiting on. So Nigel, when I go there, and I want to see the artifacts, and also submit an abstract for a paper.
It'd be nice, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So Alec, he was.
Yeah.
Last but not least.
Last but not least.
So I've done two and a bit trips abroad. So the first one was a research trip to Santiago de Compostela in northwest Spain, Galicia, and it was primarily for research. So I went to the university there, and I've been in contact with an archaeologist called Jose Carlos Sanchez Pardo, who is a specialist on sort of late Antique and early medieval Christian archaeology, primarily churches, and but also their trade relations and things as well. So he was really helpful in sort of getting me access to the university itself, but also to the library in particular, where there was a lot of sealed texts that are mostly in circulation in Spain and Portugal itself, rather than our side of Europe. And then also at the end of that stay, I was able to go to an archaeological site as well, which had just been wrapping up. It's one of the castros in that region as well, so not far from Orense. The second trip I did was for a conference in Madrid. So it's primarily just in Madrid itself, so it's at the Complutense University. And then, so I didn't really get to see much else because it was pretty much 9 to 5 for that. But at the end, I was also able to go to Toledo as well, where we were able to go to another archaeological site called Los Hitos, which was originally a Roman villa, but then was also during the Visigothic period it became sort of like a governor's estate and a hunting lodge as well, before eventually becoming a mosque during the Open period as well.
So then, when you came back to Swansea, did you feel more Spanish or English?
I definitely fit in with the sort of the Spanish culture more. I'm not really one for eating early, and the Spanish do love eating after about 8 or 9 o'clock.
Yes.
So yeah.
They have also, and same as in Portugal, we do have the 2-hour gap during lunchtime.
Yeah.
Unless they have the siesta, we don't. So that's the thing.
Yeah, I do miss siestas.
Siesta is a good thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But did you get also to communicate in English in more of a briefly, or?
Yeah, so for the first few days of the conference, it was almost entirely in Spanish. I was speaking to people there in Spanish, but then after that point, that's when my Spanish failed me a little bit, and I was beginning to struggle. And that's when they sort of. I don't quite understand how they didn't recognise that I wasn't in Spanish. I'm very, very ginger, but they eventually clocked on that I wasn't, and they were more than happy to speak to me in English because they knew I could speak Spanish, basically.
Spain has a big flaw. They don't learn English in school. They do, but they get so accustomed to the dubbed films and series. Everything is dubbed there. So to find something subtitled and obviously, and also without subtitles in English, they have to stream. so Netflix, all those things. So it's really hard for them. So they resort to private schools to learn, and there's a lot in Santiago, for example.
Yeah.
They hire not just English people, but they also hire Eastern Europeans, mainly Czech and Polish people, to teach English there.
Oh,
So yeah, from the time I was living there. So and that was it.
interesting.
It is interesting indeed. I thought they would mainly be native English speakers, but okay, so diversity matters then. So, and since we were your experience in Spain and in studying Roman Hispania, then we're going to the first question will be for you. And then going around.
Oh my God.
So it's not going to be the last but not least matter, but it's going to be first of the top. So now, just really briefly, just tell us about what you mean by lot and the gentes, and what do they mean in the context of the topic that you're researching.
So one of the first the first paper I ever gave, which was at the conference in Madrid, was on the Barbarian settlement in Spain, 411. So in the few years prior to that, in 406, there were three barbarian peoples known as the Alan Suevian Vandals, crossed the frozen Rhine on the 31st of December, and basically for the next 3 years managed to sort of work their way through Gaul, and then eventually across the Pyrenees in 409, and then sort of remained in Spain for the next 2 years. Then by 411, they decided that they wanted to settle there, and they didn't want to because this had been going on for 5 years now. That they could sort of through the migration from across the Rhine, and so they wanted to settle there. And we know this from the chronicle of the bishop known as Hydatius, and he recorded a lot of what went on in Spain through the 5th century. And so at this point, the barbarians, they decided that they wanted to settle, but the way they did this was that they drew lots. Quite literally, sort of straws, and who got what, essentially. So the Latin for this is ballo, which is source, so S-O-R-S, source, or sorte for individual. And so the paper that I was delivering was arguing sort of for a reconsideration of these laws. So in the past, a lot of scholars have either believed that it was just completely random, so it was botched, and that it was just basically a confused mass of let's just go here. And other people have said it was actually the Roman government that decided to settle them, and that they were going to specifically give them in different parts of the Iberian Peninsula. However, my arguments were on an economic basis. So I believe that on the reasons, the arguments for basically that the barbarians instead decided to basically co-opt the sort of local officials known as the curiales, basically sort of local magistrates and civil servants, to sort of help them to basically make an equal and divided settlement. And these lots were basically broken down into 4 different individual lots. So you had, which is on the basis of the provinces of Spain itself. So Spain, as we know it now, is not didn't exist at that point. So you had what was known as the Diocese Hispaniarum, which is the Diocese of Hispania, which included all of the modern Iberian Peninsula. But it also included the Balearic Islands, but also it also included Mauritania across the Straits of Gibraltar as well. So what is now sort of Tangiers and that kind of area. But the extra areas of the Balearic Islands, but also sort of North Africa, those weren't included as part of these lots. And so we're looking at the 5 individual provinces of Spain, which is going to be in the northwest, which is Galicia, sort of a little bit larger than what is now modern Galicia. You have Lusitania, which is on the western coast, which is takes up most of what is modern-day Portugal. You have Baetica in the south, which is sort of an expanded area of what is what most people would now consider Gibraltar. And then in the northeast, you have Tarraconensis,
Yes.
which is sort of a lot of modern-day Catalonia, but also the Basque region as well. And then finally, basically everywhere in between was also Carthaginiensis, which is the largest province. So Hydacius tells us that after they decided that they wanted to settle and sort of take up the plough and the yoke, they wanted to sort of turn to peace. And in this case, they divided them amongst themselves a lot. And the sort of the lots were as follows. So the Siling Vandals, because they were sort of split off between their Hasdin cousins, they take Baetica, which was one lot. They had the Alans, who took both Carthaginiensis and Lusitania, so almost half of the entire peninsula. And then you had both the Suevi and the Asding Vandals crammed into Galicia in the northwest of Spain as well, with Tarraconensis not really being included in this.
Why is that?
So it's mainly because of the Roman presence. So there was during this period there was a lot of usurpations as well. So you had the usurper Constantine III, but you also had Jovinus as well. And between the two of them, as well as the problems with Stilicho in sort of Italy and also Valia and Attorf as well, the Goths. There was a lot going on in southern Gaul, which meant that there was a heavy Roman military presence, both from rebels but also from legitimate government as well. So that's generally a reason why Tarraconensis was left alone and so they had the rest of the peninsula to themselves.
So then it was a matter of military logistics then for the so-called barbarians to have those lots to prevent a Roman counterattack, basically, or not?
I don't think in my own view, I don't think they really cared that much. I don't think they considered that. The Roman military presence in Spain itself was, whereas originally there had been quite a heavy military presence, was massively depleted by this point. From the various civil wars. So just having a small area around the Pyrenees meant that it was enough that they couldn't really deal with it themselves. So they just decided to leave the rest of it and just go, right, we'll stay here. So my arguments were that basically the individual lots based on economic reasons. So Galicia, through a lot of recent archaeological excavations, but also literary evidence as well, as there's been a lot of suggestions that Galicia was actually the most wealthy province of Spain, because there was a significant mining sort of extractions taking part in the area. So there was a lot of gold mining, and in fact at one point under the Flavian emperors, the gold mining amounted up to, I think it was 5% of the entire Roman Empire's income just from one singular mine in Galicia.
Sure.
So it just sort of goes to show how much wealth the province had. But then there was also a lot of trade, because it was basically the last sort of port of call in Hispania for the Atlantic trade routes. So everything coming out of the Mediterranean and going up towards sort of western France, but also to Britain as well, basically went through Galicia as the final stop. In fact, in A Coruña, there is still quite a large lighthouse, which is one of the reasons why this Atlantic trade route was.
Isn't that lighthouse the lighthouse of Hercules?
Yes, that's the.
It is.
Yeah.
So it's completely restored.
Yeah.
As well.
And that lighthouse itself was particularly made basically just sort of to safeguard sea trade routes along the Atlantic. So I then argued that Galicia was split into two different lots, because you had two different barbarian peoples staying there. So you had the Suevi, who were then going to take up the Atlantic trade routes, so they had the western area, and then you had the Asding Vandals, which were going to take the central areas where all the mining was.
Sure.
Then the Silene Vandals in the south and Baetica. So Baetica was very rich as well. It had a lot of olive oil, a lot of grain, and in fact in 416, one of the reasons why the Goths ended up creating a treaty with Rome was because they were starving, because due to a blockade by the Magistratum Constantius, and the Silene Vandals were selling grain to the Goths at extortionate rates, and basically just to capitalise on the fact that they were starving, which sort of just goes to show how much grain was being exported from Baetica. At some points it was akin to the same amount of grain that was produced in the Nile, but also in North Africa as well.
Sure.
And that was why that in particular was going to be one lot, and also you had the control of those trade routes, because you had obviously the Straits of Gibraltar, known as the Pillars of Hercules back then. So having that area was considered strong enough economically to be one lot. And then finally you had Carthaginiensis in Lusitania. So Lusitania was also the capital of the diocese in Merida. And it also had a significant, not significant, it had a good amount of mining as well to make it generally wealthy. But then Carthaginiensis by this point was it's
a lot of terminology. I can say.
The province of Carthaginiensis was relatively poor. There wasn't a lot of trade coming out of it. Whereas in the past, sort of going back to the sort of Republican era, the Punic and sort of colonization of that area, there had been a lot of trade, but since a lot of the Atlantic trade was more important now, its wealth had dropped off. And so I've argued that the reason why the islands received two provinces is basically to sort of make up for the economic deficit between the other three lots, essentially.
So that's so.
How do you have all of that just in your head?
It seems like you just deposited every knowledge that you had on talking research and then just. No, it's a great thought, and saying that there was Spain during the Roman period, it was in the process of a societal transformation and economic transformation as well, to organize themselves as a rather say singular community whatsoever, but within different tribes that were inhabiting all across modern Portugal and Spain. And one of the things that you said botched, the first thing that just came to my mind was say, okay, so Alec is describing me a WWE match where there's fatal four-way and the dioceses of each lot are the referees, and so I have to say, it was this saying that okay, so they are Vincent Kennedy McMahon as the ruling of the whole thing, and they are the referees. The dioceses claim, was this a deliberate botched move or something else?
No, so I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that by this point, because of the weakening Roman government, there was a lot of benefits and a lot of positive influence exerted by sort of barbarian peoples to the extent where the local provincials actually would have preferred barbarian rule, even if they were heretics or pagans or particularly nasty towards them in whatever way. They actually preferred that kind of rule over that of Roman government instead, due to their taxes and things like that. I mean, when Hydatius talks about the apocalypse basically appearing in Spain, one of the main things he mentions was the tyrannical tax collector as part of the apocalypse, because apparently that was so significant.
I mean, it's relatable.
So yeah, it's. I think there's a really good chunk of evidence to suggest that the sort of local magistrates and civil servants were not. They may have been coerced, but some of them may have been more than happy to fully support barbarian rule instead.
Yes.
And particularly by the time, sort of by the mid 5th century, you have lots of examples of sort of local Hispano-Romans supporting barbarian rule over that of the imperial government. In fact, when the Emperor Majorian wanted to sort of reconquer parts of Spain and also then launch a campaign against the Vandals in North Africa, there were specific Hispano-Romans that betrayed the imperial government and basically turned over various cities and even destroyed ships and things like that as well, transport ships, to completely scuttle this invasion. I think earlier scholars might have argued that it was botched and it was all just a sort of barbarian game, what would be a fun way of allocating different parts of Hispania. But I don't believe that. I think it was either through coercion or through agreement. I think that the sort of the locals in Hispania did want to actually basically step away from that sort of repression rule.
And they're going to see the fact as well that the Western Roman Empire was in a deep crisis, and some of them they wanted a new change. So what you're saying makes sense, and the sense of, okay, I'm going to make these coercive game to, if you do not do something for me, I will cut. Let's just say the Vandals had the whole control of the Carthaginian grain, right? So if the Romans will do this, then we do this. We cut the grain supply across the whole empire.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. And I think one of the biggest issues for the barbarian peoples in this period was whether or not they wanted to be enemies of Rome or whether they wanted to be allies of Rome, and that was a really big distinction, to the point where a lot of them wanted to sort of espouse legitimacy amongst themselves and amongst their own people by saying that they could sort of, as I've argued in a lot of my research, take on the role of Roman government.
Sure.
So some of the stuff that I've been looking at more recently is how the Suevi sort of wanted to take on the military role. So where the original army of Spain, the Exercitus Hispanicus, had been destroyed and left or disbanded, they then stepped in to show, we can do this. You don't need to worry about Spain. We'll sort of control it on your behalf instead. And so by doing that, they were able to sort of push back against other barbarian peoples as well, such as the Goths, when they were not particularly on favourable terms with the Romans. But then also against the Vandals as well. So in the 450s, you have examples of the Vandals raiding the western coastline of Sweden and taking hostages, because basically they've been getting too big for their boots to a certain extent.
It seems like there's a lot of mind games then at the time.
Oh, absolutely.
So one of the things that you also shared me once, that if there was a Suevic identity in Galicia, right? And also there was some, Galaico-Portuguese words. And while at the time I was in Santiago, I didn't notice about that. They would speak Galician to me. I wouldn't mind because I would understand it. But I'm curious about the words, some of those words. Do you have it some in memory?
Not off the top of my head. Most of them were actually related to nature, sort of birds and the names and things like that as well. And there are certain toponyms that are still sort of related to Suevi. So in areas of northern Portugal, on the border with Galicia, but also in certain Galician towns, they are, some of the place names are, for example, I think there's something about 18 different towns across Galicia and northern Portugal which are still called Suevos.
Wow, I'm impressed now.
Yeah, and you'll be driving in and it will, the sign that says welcome to whatever, it just says Suevos, which shows that these were sort of clear settlements where these people had resided, or maybe even because of something that happened. But yeah, there were still a lot of sort of examples of this and come across. I don't know what happened there.
Well, you got it there. I know.
Yeah,
That's fine.
yeah, but there are still. I'll try and find some video for you now. Yeah, there are still certain place name words that are used. I know exactly where it is.
You're having a moment of silence.
Yeah,
So Alex
exactly.
is about to share something big.
So there are. I mean, forgive me for some terrible pronunciation. But mehengra. Mehengra, yeah. It's for a word for something called a titmouse.
Can you just flip and then just show me if I can?
See these ones. Yeah. So some of them come. A lot of them come from sort of Proto-Germanic.
Meshengra.
Mashengra.
Okay, yeah, I completely butchered that.
To be fair, you're not Portuguese or Spanish, so.
Yeah, because also we do in the northern Portugal we do have a second language. We speak Mirandês,
Okay.
which is it's a local language.
Yeah.
It's not spoken in the south, just it's northern language exclusively. So it probably maybe approximately, I don't know, Mark can tell you probably about this language, and but it's basically a language that was spoken by the Portuguese from the north, and they kept it until today, and it's still taught in schools.
Okay.
So
yeah.
Cool.
it probably comes from that too. So maybe a mix between Suevi language with Galician and northern Portuguese and Mirandês.
I thought it looked familiar. Mashengra. It's the same as the Old Norse. I was like, that looks. Yeah, that's.
Machine.
It's the same. It's the same as the Old Norse for titmouse, which is really weird. But
Yeah.
well,
It's there's still quite there is still a distinct identity. In fact, actually, there's that picture there. That's in La Coruña of the village of Suevos, or a village of Suevos.
Trás-Monte. Yeah, we have Trás os Montes. We have Trás-Monte. So it really differs, but it's really attached some of the Galician and Portuguese language, specifically in the northern side. So the dialects are really close to between those two languages. So
Yeah, no, there's I think over the course of the 5th and 6th century, there was a real there was a new identity sort of imprinted in the northwest of the peninsula, which really I think it contributed to sort of the kingdom's continued survival, but it also meant that even after the annexation of the kingdom by the Visigoths in 505, it meant that there was there's still a huge presence of this identity in the area that basically almost nothing changed.
Sure.
You know, they went from having a Suevic king to just having a Visigothic governor. Other than that, there was no different change. A lot of the nobles were still in power. 2 years later, when the Visigothic king Recared converted to Catholicism, the Suevi were already Catholic. So again, there was no change there at all. So there's it was a particularly unique situation for them, and I know there's in the 7th century as well. In the same way as we have in the UK, you've got the king, but then you've got the Prince of Wales.
yes,
In Visigothic kingdom, you had the king, and then you had the Prince of Galicia. And so then they were the ones that were supposedly rule over the Galicians instead, which goes to show that this sort of Suevic Galician kingdom in the northwest was still this identity was still really apparent even beyond almost 100 years after its demise. And some recent scholarship has actually suggested that there was a huge political faction in the region as well, which actually almost decided who became kings in the Visigothic kingdom. They were sort of known as a king-making faction, essentially. and because they were still so powerful, and there were a lot of rebellions and things that sort of went against them in that respect. And then obviously even beyond that period, after the sort of the fall of the Visigoth kingdom in 711, you've got the kingdom of Asturias as well, and a lot of that sort of power base was from Galicia and from this sort of basically identity that was created there.
Sorry, just Ella and I being like, yeah. Like, oh yes, the kingdom of the like.
I think
Whatever you want to. Then you see just Alec does a huge entire lecture, and this is so Ella's like, okay.
Yeah, I forget. Like, I'm so
No, but this is also part of the podcast is that I also wanted to establish this live, having some fun, having some conversation about the daily life, and also specifically towards our research topics as well. But having a bit of a guest as well, so a bit of laugh too. So now
I wasn't the only one.
So now that Alec has given us a very broad and no, I'm not in a just that has given us an amazing share with his research topic, and I'll just turn to Bella in explaining about her research topic, and I asked straight away, what do you mean by symbolic blackness, and is it used in early Christian literature, and how does it interact with gender? And I can ask another question straightforward as well. Does it relate to the stories of Anthony and Mary of Egypt, as you also said to me?
Symbolic blackness is just a term that means colour symbolism. It basically means that the colour black means something in early Christian literature.
Which in common.
Yeah. So I think quite a useful example is when if you consider like imperial Rome, so purple was a colour kind of only worn by the upper echelons of society and the imperial family. So the phrase taking the purple became synonymous with luxury and the taking of imperial power. And so it's just that same idea that applies to blackness, that if someone or something is described as black or burnt black, blackened, or kind of something similar to that, there's certain connotations that come with it. In the context of Christian literature, quite a useful kind of statement that you hear a lot, obviously, is that Jesus is the light.
Yes.
So it suggests that the opposite is something to be feared, something to be vanquished. And so you find in a lot of early Christian literature, demons and the devil are described as burnt black, blackened, or just Egyptian and Ethiopian. So that's... Yeah. If you take away all the kind of modern context, it's quite an interesting literary device. I'll talk about how it interacts with gender. I'll be honest, there isn't a simple answer. But I think that drawing on this kind of two important texts, which I'm going to talk about, the ones you mentioned, Anthony the Great and Mary of Egypt, because their narratives is a really good parallel, kind of showing how this blackness is used and the different ways that it's used. So the first text is the life of Anthony the Great, the father of desert asceticism, which is written in 356 CE by Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria. Asceticism is a kind of extreme Christian devotion in which you deny earthly pleasures. So it's generally involves withdrawing from society. So obviously desert fathers, desert mothers, they literally just went off into the desert. And it also involves kind of starvation, celibacy, and kind of bodily mortification.
Didn't St. Jerome and St. Augustine did the same? Yeah,
in kind of varying ways. Some of them went and did it, for a bit, and then came back. Quite a common kind of form of bodily mortification is wearing a hair shirt. So priests and things would wear it underneath their vestments, and it just means they'd be like in constant discomfort. That's quite a common one. Yeah, I don't get it myself personally, but that's fine. But so this, when Antony is in the desert, he's praying, the devil takes a real interest in kind of testing him. And a quote from it, which kind of got me going on the whole PhD, to be honest, is the devil came next to Antony as a black boy, his appearance matching his mind. So there's quite an obvious correlation between blackness and evil here, like it's pretty explicit. So Antony as a man is presented as fighting the devil and kind of easily defeating him. It's when you look at the life of Mary of Egypt, which is a 7th century text, there are several kind of narrative similarities to the life of Antony. So a monk called Zosimus, he's characterised in much the same way as Antony, and part of my research is basically saying that I think that the narrative construction of the life of Mary is massively modelled on Antony the Great, and that Zosimus is essentially a kind of literary successor to Antony. But so when Zosimus is wandering about in the desert, as they all do, he sees a creature, and this creature is described as having a shadowy illusion of a human body. It was burnt black by the scorching sun. And Zosimus actually worries that it's a demonic phantom, and even the Greek literally says demonic phantom, worried that it's come to, deceive him. When it's actually, that's the first description of Mary of Egypt, the reformed prostitute saint, who's actually one of the most highly venerated desert mothers in the Orthodox Church. So a large part of what I'm arguing in my thesis is that Mary comes to Zosimus much in the same way that the devil comes to Antony. And so you get this kind of the way that blackness is used in this sense. It shows how it interacts with gender. So Antony, the man, is confronted by the devil, the black boy. But Zosimus, the man, is confronted by Mary, who is burnt black. So, and that's, both of these texts were hugely popular. There's widely circulated, so many different translations, so many manuscripts. So to kind of ancient Christians and ancient readers, that would not have gone unnoticed, that parallel. I'm still developing my ideas, but I think the way that Zosimus doubts Mary's holiness because of her blackness, I think speaks to a much wider kind of narrative strategy, in which blackness is implemented along kind of gendered lines to suggest that female holy figures are less spiritually credible than their male counterparts. And sometimes this is explicit, sometimes it's implicit, but it features in a lot of different ways across the 5 texts I'm using as part of my thesis. Was there another question in there that I've gone over? I can't remember.
So were they written mainly in Greek or completely translated into Latin? Ecclesiastical Latin?
Yeah, so all of the texts I look at are written in Greek. They're not necessarily originally written in Greek.
Sure.
Antony the Great, Mary of Egypt. What other ones am I doing? So many. Those two are definitely written in Greek. I'm looking at a Greek recension of the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicitas, which is a much, much earlier text. That's quite an interesting one because that's originally written in Latin and was then translated into Greek, which is quite unusual. But I'm looking at the much later. The Latin version of that text, I think, is early 3rd century. Ella, you're hungry. The Perpetua and Felicitas is early 3rd century, but the Greek version is dated between the 9th and 11th centuries. It's the same for Pelagia of Antioch. I'm looking at a 10th, 11th century Greek version.
Sure.
The original was in Greek, but it's lost, so the earliest surviving version we have is in Syriac. I don't know, no one knows this Greek version I'm looking at, which version was used to translate into Greek. It might have been the original and it's been revised, or it might have been Syriac, or it might have been Latin. I don't know. No one knows. So I'm just going to have to...
So might have been some rewritten into a biased viewpoint.
So the guy who actually wrote this particular narrative is literally called Simeon Metaphrastes, which is literally Simeon the Reviser. So he has massively condensed it and altered it. So that's lots and lots of detective work for me. But yeah, I am looking for Greek, and looking at it in that respect. So
it's really interesting to reading those stories, and now you sharing your research. It kind of differs about the linguistic view, but also it's sort of a target to make a difference between genders. So as from what I understood, we say that Zosimus gets received by Mary because Mary got being black burned. Then there's a violent attack to the female nature, whereas the other side of in Antony's tale, Antony's story, it seems less. It seems quite more balanced, intuitive into portraying something in him differently than.
Yeah. So the kind of use of blackness is just kind of one of the I think narrative strategies that are used to portray women in a certain way. But you often find that the way that, say, men experience temptation is very, very different to how women experience it. But it depends on something I'm looking at. Is so, for example, Pelagia of Antioch is a transvestite nun, basically. So she's the first amongst city harlots in Antioch. And after she kind of sees the light, she takes off her kind of finery, dresses in a tattered rag, and then retreats to the Mount of Olives and goes under Pelagios. And something I'm looking at with her story is that she dresses in a male monastic habit, and she goes by Pelagios, and her experience of temptation is very similar to that of male saints. And so it's like a sliding scale, and there is no one kind of narrative that sticks exactly within all the same boxes. But I think the use of blackness is a really useful way to kind of pinpoint certain parts. I think.
So maybe, or perhaps a kind of a religious excuse to pointing fingers. Okay, because they're black, but specifically from Egypt and Ethiopia.
Yeah.
So I wonder why if that was an obsession for the demonic in behavior in Christian Late Antiquity.
Yeah. So I've thought about this a lot because this is something that is pre-Christian as well. You get these kind of in like Herodotus and also in Heliodorus as well in the Ethiopian story. Again, it's one of those things where I don't know the definitive answer, but I think there's certainly some factors, and I think part of it is that certainly before the rise of monasticism, which obviously originated in Egypt, you had the same kind of language used, and Egyptian and Ethiopian were often quite interchangeable in these kind of early texts. And I think part of that is just because ancient geographers actually really struggled to get to Ethiopia, and there's actually very few accounts of its kind of like topography or its culture. I think due to this, it kind of took on these mystical properties and became like a fertile ground for kind of literary imagination. So the outskirts or like the edge of the known world have always been a space where kind of strange creatures and cultures can kind of spawn. It's got much more
Does that relate to the fact that they're trying to evangelize Ethiopia and Egypt?
What do you mean exactly?
So in trying to, I'm not sure if they wanted to bring Christianity over to Egypt and to Ethiopia and trying to Christianize the whole both of the lands. So I wonder if that has some certain influence. Yeah,
it might do. I think certainly for the case of Egypt, again, this before monasticism anyway. I think Egypt was known for its kind of powerful and respected healers, and then just in general, its culture was really highly revered in late antiquity. Its gods are even more ancient, and their pantheon of gods were worshipped outside of Egypt as well. But I think after the rise of monasticism in Egypt, you found that the Egyptian authors were using the same kind of invective language against Ethiopians that had been used against both of them. So they were kind of trying to separate themselves almost. And so, the kind of stereotype of an Egyptian changed in the 500 years after Christ that it came to Egypt.
So essentially there was a conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia then?
I wouldn't say it was like an overt one. But I can sense, this is something that I think it might not be correct, but something that I've noticed in the earlier texts I study and the later texts is that there are certain kind of linguistic elements that kind of point towards Egyptian authors kind of very, very subtly shifting the way that they use language and separating themselves from the kind of previous characterization, I suppose.
So, in the end, it is still an idea trying to develop, and
it's incredibly complicated.
But it is trying to stay to the fact that for the listeners who are devoted Christians and have some field of background in theology, then it really resonates with what their teachings, and I think that there would be a great way to showcase a different perspective of that they have. There's an equal ground towards the literary interpretations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of both Anthony and Mary of Egypt, which I don't see any reason whatsoever to make such a difference of symbolic blackness whatsoever. After all, it's a figurative term.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly. It's just a literary construct in this.
Literary construct.
Yeah.
Any archaeological evidence also you touch upon besides the literature?
To be honest, in kind of very, very briefly, but
Sure.
I think because I'm doing 5 texts from, there's North Africa, Antioch, and Greece. That's quite a lot to cover. So I'm trying not to give myself an aneurysm by drawing on too much.
Right.
I look at archaeological and kind of more kind of physical evidence more for my own.
Will be there any trip to North Africa in the future?
I would love to, but
to Egypt, right? And,
there's the monastery in Mount Sinai, and they have fragments and all sorts, but I would have to go in a group. Unfortunately, it's not the safest place to travel. Which is a shame because I'd love to go. But at some point it's on my bucket list. Yeah. So one day, but I probably should finish my PhD first.
I think we have all plans to go somewhere, and then first this PhD in first
post
place.
PhD, yeah.
So maybe just going into a postdoc or whatsoever.
Yeah.
I don't know. But so last but not least. So Ella, sexual deviancy in the 18th and early 19th. What message the theatrical works and the theatrical works in literature also they wanted to portray about sexual deviancy? How would, in other words, how sexual deviancy was practiced during this time?
Good questions. There were kind of different representations of sexual deviancy in different types of texts. So I'm really defining sexual deviancy as adultery in this instance, and there were also some cases of bastardy or illegitimacy. So it's quite interesting because one of the novels I'm looking at is Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. That was published in 1814. So 2 of the characters in that elope as an adulterous couple, basically. It's Maria Rushworth at the end, elopes with Mr. Henry Crawford, and it's a big scandal. So essentially both novels and plays are very disapproving of sexual deviancy and adultery and sort of use it as a warning to young women or their readers to say, don't do it, basically. But it's quite interesting because they portray it in different ways. So whereas something like Austen's novels very much act like a warning, one of the plays I'm studying is called A School for Scandal by Richard Brinsley Sheridan, published in 1777, and it's very much like a comedy of elite manners, which is something that's, I wouldn't say like unusual for the time, but it's something that's quite different. So it very much mocks the elite people for their manners, especially through their names. So you have characters like Lady Sneerwell, for example, and like Lady Teasel, which really kind of like takes the mick out of the upper classes and how they behave, because adultery was generally perceived to be rife amongst the upper classes, and like people were worried that that would cause anxiety amongst the mass population, because people would worry that that's what like they would aspire to do then, like they would start committing adultery all over the place. So yeah, that was a big worry.
So but does it differ from elite and non-elite?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the main differences is that we don't know a lot about non-elite adultery apart from in trials. It's like a lot harder to access because a lot of these elite women had very much like a celebrity status, a little bit like today's celebrities, where they have better access to like print culture. You know, it would be more like reporters would report on any scandals and things like that. So it would differ in the sense that, yeah, so the non-elite women I'm looking at, for example, I have to access through varsity examinations, like more of poor people who would be illiterate, not able to read or write, and the result of their sexual deviance would often be an illegitimate child. So that would be quite different to like the media frenzy, I guess, like surrounding the elite women who experienced adultery, and often elite women, they had access to lots of money so their husbands could send them away to give birth to an illegitimate child abroad, for example. That was quite popular, a big thing that would happen. I say popular, that's probably the wrong word, but that was sort of like a done thing, you know. Can't really know how popular it was, but yeah.
I do, and then we're touching upon this, and I finished yesterday watching the Ridley Scott's Napoleon film, and obviously, historical inaccuracies aside, I was watching that Napoleon was trying to have a son and heir to the throne through Josephine, and then I've seen some of the sexual acts. It was more of like rehearsed things and programmed in a certain sense, and said Napoleon was having a problem. If you don't give me a fucking child, I will slit your throat. You know? So they had to resort to an elite teenager from the elite groups. Well, he actually got ahead to the throne, Napoleon II. But seeing from also the non-elite perspective, it goes all the way to the same. What they just change is okay, but that disgraceful one doesn't have royal blood. I do have the blue blood, but you see, it goes all the same. What do you think about it?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, actually, because there was a lot of anxiety around illegitimacy, definitely in the early modern period. So some arguments by historians is that during the 18th century there was a lot more sort of sexual freedom or liberation of people, and then I think a well-known thing is that during the Victorian era, sexual morals became a lot stricter and tighter, mainly due to the influence of Queen Victoria. But yeah, there was definitely a lot of public anxiety, I think, around like children being legitimate, especially amongst elite people and elite husbands in particular. Like there was a lot of anxiety that they wanted their sons who would inherit their property to be like definitely their son. And there's very much sort of like, I guess, gender disparity. What's the word? The gender double? No, not that one. It'll come back to me. But the double standard, that's it.
I was about to say that too, but I will tell it.
I got it in the end. But yeah, so like, in the sense that men were able to go off and have sex with whoever they wanted, whereas that wasn't the case for women at all. They were expected to remain. There was definitely an expectation on elite women to like remain faithful to their husbands. So when they strayed out of that boundary or sort of like crossed that like invisible line, I guess, that was then perceived as quite scandalous and not the done thing to do at all.
So scandalous to one side and then not scandalous to non-elite then.
Yeah, definitely. I think so.
It's the same in the imperial period as well.
The same in-
It didn't change at all in 1500 years.
Yeah, it's crazy how the whole values of that system hasn't changed really much throughout history.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I wonder as well if the practice of I now botched the word. So the practice of sexual deviancy, adultery, as we say, and then from non-elite women to have illegitimate child, wasn't the fact also that at this time of the period was the Industrial Revolution, and in order to have a massive production of industry materials, that practice was also some sort of deliberate practice in order to grow the population of England and maybe Wales and Scotland as well, to continue the mass production of the Industrial Revolution. Makes sense?
I don't necessarily think so. I think the Industrial Revolution was sort of also quite separate, in the sense that it was more so to do with the production of goods and output more internationally, improving Britain's trade links, for example, with the colonies. That was quite a big time for colony globalization and things like that. Britain expanding its empire.
Well, I wonder whether it's big. Sorry, Ella. I wondered because that was during the Industrial Revolution was a massive increase of child labor. So I wonder if that can take from that too.
Yeah, so something that became quite popular during the Industrial Revolution was the workhouse, and a lot of the time, poor women who had illegitimate children who wouldn't be able to afford to care for them would put them into sort of an 18th century version of the care system.
Sure.
Where they would be put into workhouses to sort of, in their keep, in inverted commas. I could be wrong, but I think there was definitely a lot of mistreatment of these children.
I was about to say,
in
I remember
conditions were very poor.
Very, very, very briefly remember something from year 9 history where we learned about kids getting in the cotton, the weave, the looms and stuff, and they'd be sent to pick, to get all this spares.
Yes, because they had their hands.
They were and they were just
softer.
small, so they could crawl inside the machines. So I know, I think that is right. A lot of children died because
No, that's definitely correct. There's a really good drama actually on Channel 4 that used to be on called The Mill. That was a really good depiction of how child labour was used in the workhouse, and it's really brutal how some children would eventually have to have their arms amputated, for example, when they get injured in the workhouse, and the foremen or the people who'd be in charge of overseeing the children just they didn't care at all. And I think there was definitely quite a high mortality rate in some workhouses as well, especially amongst children.
But yeah, thankfully the elite children won't have to deal with that. They'll be summering in France.
Definitely a different kettle of fish.
But it's really interesting that, speaking about this topic that you were researching, and also seeing from a non-elite perspective, it's quite a challenge for you then. Because there's a lack of sources, right?
Yeah, definitely. That's kind of part of the reason why I stayed away from the medieval and classical period, because there was a complete lack of sources.
Yeah, sources are really annoying.
I did a lot of medieval history in undergraduate, and I found it really hard just trying to focus on one source material for an entire essay, just trying to around it.
Alec knows all about that, didn't you, with your one source?
Yeah, how is it going?
That's amazing. It's great.
So in my period, the early modern period, there's definitely a lot more sources than in the medieval or late antiquity, for example. But in my case, it is definitely a challenge trying to track these more working class women or middling women who weren't necessarily as visible in print culture. So I have to kind of try and think outside of the box of ways to access these materials, for example.
It is interesting how that trend hasn't really changed though, because it's the same in ancient culture.
Yeah.
It's only we have loads of sources about, say, like kind of gender in family structures from the imperial period, but it's all about elite women, and there's very, very little about like lower class women, and all the stuff that does exist is very, very biased because obviously it's written by elite Roman males. So so it's
a bit off topic, but I went to an exhibition in the British Library on medieval women. It's brilliant. I highly recommend people to go. But a lot of it was focused on elite women or nuns who were in monasteries, and there was
all the stereotypes.
All the medieval stereotypes that I think of, and nothing featuring about the more ordinary women who made up the massive Britain's population at the time, I think, which is quite scary. So it's just crazy how not a lot of it is lost in time, I guess, or lost in history.
I think it's quite interesting when even the people who do get sort of spoken about in the records, like if they come from a humble background, that's generally speaking, that's all we know. They're like, they came from nothing. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Do you want to give us some detail?
What's the detail?
Yeah, story there.
Exactly. Yeah. There's plenty of people who end up in the high places, but because they came from somewhere else, you don't really, that's not really talked about. It's just the fact that it's almost just like a little bit of. It becomes
like a narrative trope, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, he came from nothing. They came from nothing.
Yeah.
And it's like, actually, I'd quite like to know about the nothing, please.
Tell us a bit then, if you can. So, and it's actually funny because Bella said that literally nothing changed in general, and that also applies to of what we what we are seeing on social media nowadays with this whole thing of the manosphere. So I know it's a hatred topic, and I deeply agree with you, Bella. But it was interesting just if there's any parallel with adultery back in this time to nowadays.
It's really interesting you ask that, because I actually see lots of parallels and like comparisons between today and my period that I'm studying. Like I often think about people like the royal family now and the royal women in that, like Kate Middleton, like Camilla, who's now the current queen, and Meghan Markle. They're all different, very like different royal figures, I guess, in today's modern world, and that's kind of very much the same to some of the elite women I'm studying from like the 1700s. So there was one really famous, well, I wouldn't say famous, relatively well-known elite woman called Lady Seymour Woosley, who committed adultery with her husband's best friend at the time. And he finally, her husband, Richard Worsley, finally sued his best friend called Richard in 1782, I believe. And that sort of, Seymour was very much vilified in the press and depicted as somebody who was very provocative. And I think a lot of that is kind of also quite kind of similar to what happens today to women like Meghan Markle, and also like, for example, did you guys see last night with the Grammys about this sheer see-through nude dress of Kanye West's wife? What's her name? I can't remember her name. Bianca something.
Yeah.
We're not exactly up to date with the... but no, there was like a big backlash about that, and they were apparently kicked out of the Grammys because of her nude dress and basically showing up naked. So yeah, I see a lot of parallels between then and now, and how women are portrayed, I guess, in the media. It's kind of quite funny how things started off in the early modern period as today's sort of current like mass media culture that we call it.
Yes.
And it's now kind of snowballed with all the current technology of social media into this big
It does seem to be this like extremes. So it's one of my chapters is about it's essentially being from like a warning for others to being like a paragon of virtue, and there doesn't seem to be much of an in-between. And I talk about how like prostitute saints, so like Mary of Egypt and Pelagia, they kind of doubly defy late antique ideals of femininity, because they don't have virginal girlhoods, because they're being prostitutes. And then instead of settling down and getting married, they then become celibate. And it's certainly with like female saints anyway, it's often that they either come from the absolute depths of depravity, like Mary of Egypt, who just runs away at the age of 12 to become a prostitute in Alexandria, doesn't even charge, like refuses to take payment, she just loves it, basically. Literally. And
it seems quite a hobby the way you were expressing it.
But that's the thing, she refuses, and she makes a big deal about the fact that she doesn't take payment for it, and that she corrupts men left, right, and centre, and the sea should swallow her whole for the depths of her sin, and she kind of goes from being that to then being almost like neutralised completely. Even down to the Greek describing her doesn't actually ever use feminine participles. It's always masculine or neuter. So it's almost like her femininity is completely erased.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of interesting that it's either they're the godly, saintly, perfect woman, as kind of indicated by the patriarchy, or they're basically just whores.
Yeah.
And there doesn't seem to be any kind of middle ground.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I think this it will be really hard for men and women to reach a middle ground on these sort of things, because there's no specific answer for that, and we will always get the debates about this thing. Many of them unnecessary, because we still, I don't know, how long have we ever been on this earth without counting CE, just saying like what?
Too long.
Too long, right? So we're still learning on this process, and what we could say, aka the modern archetype of the simple, the nice guy, and we see around this, I know they're quite heavy words to describe it, but it's unfortunately the way it is, and we just don't seem to get it right, how we can behave towards other people in the sense, and so we resort to the most deepest and preposterous acts of as if we were in acts of desperation. Yeah,
I think a lot of the time, certainly with something that really tickles me about the manosphere is that you often find with these kind of hyper kind of masculine spaces, whatever they think masculinity is, they often draw on like Greeks and Romans, and I'm like, do you realise that they were like the gayest people around?
And we also
it was so much more fluid than they think it is, and I think people it's difficult for me to say, because obviously like I study gender in the ancient world, so I'm always very aware of how fluid everything is, and that it's not black and white ever. And I think most people forget actually just how complex it is, and it's not as simple as this is what it means to be a man, this is what it means to be this. Like, it's those things differ on culture, time period, and it's so much more complicated than people anticipate.
It's sort of more of a marketing thing, and also look at the example of these Greek statues, these people, how they were represented, how they were in ancient Greece. Well, in a sense, that would be emasculated and with great physicality in ancient Greece and Rome, but obviously that has a different symbolism around those statues. So,
like what it means to be masculine in, say, imperial Rome in that period, what it means to be masculine somewhere else, say like the Near East, could be completely different.
And
it's I think it
And we've seen also, so we're going to see these big, giant, bulky Greek, because they were divine representations. If we go just to the they are also wildly represented, but they are less represented in nowadays culture, modern culture. There was also the depiction of boys as well in ancient Greece and Rome. But they are not really shown on social media and the internet in general.
No.
But they exist, and that's what's the representation. That's what is a true representation of a Greek individual, a Roman individual was. So,
Yeah, exactly.
till it reaches its adult stage. So
Yeah, it's all very grey, and that can be stressful, which is fair because we're human beings. We like to categorise and understand things, and sometimes it's never that simple.
But either way, I think that it's an amazing topic, and just glad that you brought this, and also trying to draw a parallel of the difference of sexual deviancy of that time to what comes nowadays, even though the generality of all this of this practice comes also to until today. But I don't know if it is more violent or less or balanced violence, but seems more that with the internet and social media that there is more constant attacks targeting if you don't do this, if you are this and you act this like this.
Are there any women in your sources, Alec?
Yeah.
Yes. I was thinking about this as you were talking because although a lot of the sort of historical characters and things that I look at are almost exclusively men. One of the sort of recently is so I mentioned that in the 450s the Vandals raided the coast of Galicia, and it took captives. And recently, in the last sort of 20 years, we found a marble sarcophagus in North Africa, in where sort of not too far from the Vandal capital, which was of a lady called Ermengondas. And this lady was a Suevic, most likely a Suevic noble, and this has been linked to the raids on the coast by the Vandals. And it seems that she may have been captured as a child and brought back to the Vandal kingdom, and she was then probably most likely forced to marry a Vandal noble as well. However, this sarcophagus was dedicated to her, not to her husband, and he was then clearly buried alongside her much later on. And this was the fact that he even existed was just tacked on to the the actual inscription at the end. It's entirely about her. It's when she died, and how old she was. Yes.
She was married to this guy.
and it's all about her, and it's fascinating that this sarcophagus was basically dedicated to someone who was kidnapped as a child, forced to marry a local noble, and then somehow she's managed to basically pull it off and it's a lot of money.
That is finding a silver lining out of a bad situation.
I think it goes to show that, for me personally, it's also the only sort of voice I have of that normal person that you talk about, because I don't have any of those voices either. And the closest you get is from inscriptions saying I died here, or someone dragged someone here.
Did she have a lot of money then, or not really? She was just an ordinary person.
Just say with a marble. So
with a marble sarcophagus, that sort of generally you'd think that there was a lot of money to do with that.
Same.
But other than that, we don't know. We know that she was a Catholic, which is interesting because the raids were during the 450s. So the Suevic king at the time was the first barbarian Catholic monarch as well. So it potentially means that she was because the Vandals were Arian Christians, which is a sort of heretical belief. So it means that she was clearly brought up as a Catholic, and then still managed to retain that Catholicism well beyond her captivity as well. And then also she retained her identity. She's described explicitly as a Sueve in the inscription on her sarcophagus.
So do you know what age she was kidnapped?
No.
Because that would be really interesting. I wondered, for her to retain that identity, it depends how young she is, I suppose.
So we could probably work. Actually, no. I think we could probably do know how old she was. She was 47 when she died, And so I think, or 37. I think 37. So I think she must have been about 12.
I'll say like old enough to remember her former life and still kind of have all that.
Yeah, life expectancy was a lot shorter back then.
37's pretty good.
I believe the sarcophagus says that she dies in about 478. I mean, this is all just off the top of my head, so don't quote me on that. But I believe she died in 478, and the raids were in about 452, 453. So it's about 25 years. So she must have been about 12.
Damn.
But yeah, it's also this is all in Latin as well. Description. So clearly means that she was either hired someone to do it for her, or in fact that she was able to, given that she had all of this specifically inscribed. That also goes potentially also that she was educated. So
that's so interesting.
There's a lot to say just from this one sarcophagus, and it both sort of fall from in the roles of sort of gender norms, but also about elites as well.
Did a girl keep a diary? Come on,
So maybe just like it's a whole life narrative that was inscribed straight on that.
I think she had a pretty traumatic life.
But I mean, but then at the same time, it's almost like something from a story from some of your period, because it's kidnapped, forced to marry someone. Clearly, maybe it was potentially a happy marriage because she seems quite important.
And that's the thing, like it's traumatic in our modern standards, but back then that was fairly, women were forced to marry whoever, basically.
It was quite normal.
Yeah, it was culturally normal. But yeah, damn, it's a shame there's nothing more about her because she sounds like a character.
Yeah, no, she's a really, really interesting person, and hopefully, there may be some more archaeological evidence come out of it. But
Damn.
So you were talking about the apocalyptical act. So you guys have organized the conference. No. Organized, but not. But it's not live yet.
No.
So
no.
So what is about it then? Why the word apocalypse, by the way? So
the title of the conference is Apocalypsis Nunc, Apocalypse and Calamity in the Ancient World. So it's being hosted here at Swansea University. And in July. Yes, in the first week of July. And the idea is that it's a very broad conference, so they've got panels from all different eras of classical research,
from archaic to late antique. So it really is wanted to make it as broad as possible, so we get as many people to come along.
And there's a lot to talk about with apocalypse, because it's not just physical apocalypse as well. So one of the panels is the destruction of identity, the ideas of apocalypse are so widespread in both in all different parts of culture. I think to a certain extent people don't even recognise it because it's we talk about it, even our language use can. I mean, I mentioned earlier things like the tyrannical tax.
Please do your paper on tyrannical.
But it's something that is it's funny to us because we can relate to it as well. So even back 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago,
people are still pissed about taxes.
These ideas are very widespread, and what we can. Even if we're having a bad day, to us that can be apocalyptic. And even in a sort of a tongue-in-cheek sort of way, apocalypse is a really important area to discuss.
So when is the deadline then? To submit an abstract?
28th of February.
Yeah, so abstracts need to be in by 28th of February, hopefully we're going to get this published as well, which should be going to a collected volume. should be great. And then there's also going to be an excursion as well during the conference.
Yes.
So I would say here to the listeners, any of you who is a PhD or even a PhD graduate, so make sure to submit your abstracts to this amazing conference. I'll put the link on the show notes, and you guys will have so much fun. We have an amazing department of classics, ancient history, and Egyptology as well. That we warmly welcome anyone to Swansea University, because it's in July, which means we have good sun.
Yeah, the beach.
So the beach. I know. I understand the rain, but we're not gonna be happy. So it's summertime. You come to here, have some snacks, go to the Egypt Center as well.
It's shaping up to be like it's going to be a really interesting group of academics as well. You know, we've got people coming from the States, from Spain, from Norway. Like it's going to be a really good opportunity, I think. So
it will be definitely a great opportunity, and also
beach.
If you go in, you get the beach as well. You can network with the beach as well. So, all in all, submit an abstract. Alec and Bella will revise, and then if you are successful, then just come along and network, and also make long life friendships here. So it's the best. Right, guys. So it's time to wrap it up, and we had an amazing topics here. Would like to ask you, what advice do you have for the listeners who might be undergraduate, masters as well, and who decided to study for a PhD, and also to those who are in their first year of their doctoral marathon? Any advice that you guys have?
I think what I would say is that this is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yes.
I think in undergrad and masters, it's something I'm still having to kind of remind myself of, even in my third year of PhD, is that undergrad and masters, you get very used to having very, very short deadlines, tiny word counts. And you get used to having that and just kind of going. PhD, it's not like that. You have to just completely take that hat off and just trust the process and chip away at it every day. It is a really different way of studying. So yeah, it's essentially just trust the stuff that you're going to be researching. It is meant to be difficult. It's going to be challenging, and you're not going to be able to figure out your entire thesis in like a month. I have spent, oh my God, like 3 months looking at one manuscript. And that's normal, even if it feels like I want to bash my head against a wall sometimes. But yeah, it's essentially just trust the process and remind yourself daily, if needs be, that it's a massive project, and you have to actually cut yourself some slack for that.
Yeah, in the same vein, I just say don't give up and keep going.
Persevere.
It gets tough.
Persevere.
It's key. And utilise all the help you can get as well. Ask your supervisors for advice. Even just moaning to other PhD students or friends can really help sometimes. Because a lot of the time, lots of people are in the same boat as you and just aren't saying so, or maybe aren't as vocal about it as others. So, yeah,
it can be very lonely. It's because you go from having course mates to suddenly being on your own thing.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that Ella and I started at the same time.
Yes.
And for the first semester, it was pretty much just us. Like, we didn't really know anyone else, and it did feel a bit like we were just kind of thrown off into the abyss.
like rugby balled into the void.
Yeah. So yeah, just kind of like finding your postgrad research kind of community as well, I think is really, really important.
Yeah.
Last but not least,
I think from my view, I think from my view, it's having a schedule, making sure you are able to, you don't overwork yourself. Basically,
Yes.
I think if you think if you just have lots of, say you have a potentially a personal deadline with a supervisor or something like that, and you think you have to get it all done in a certain period. Just making sure that you parcel everything out and make sure that it's in a manageable bites, having making sure you know exactly when you're working and when also you have time off as well, because at the end of the day, time off is really important. You don't want to have burnout. You don't want to end up in a situation where you don't feel like you can carry on with your research because you've done too much.
It's a huge culture of overworking in academia as well, and it's like treating it almost just like any other job. You get sick leave, you get holiday, and you should. I try and treat it as like a 9 to 5, close enough anyway. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. So it is the consistency, nonetheless, and just having some rest, drink plenty of water, and have some food around you as well, just to munch, and just treat it as an 8-hour job, essentially, whether you are funded or not funded. So all it matters here is the PhD is literally a marathon. It's more than 40 kilometers. But if you want to go to marathon in Greece, you feel free to do the PhD there. And again, it's the perseverance and doing what you do best. If you wanted to go for a PhD, it means that you're good, and you will have faults, and you will fail a lot, and that's how a good PhD should be. I think it's irrelative of the age that you start your PhD. Most of us start in mid and almost late 20s, and it's just they finish in their early and mid 30s. So that's the thing. So Bella, Alec, Bella, thank you so much for having the time to have this amazing talk. Let's just when's the deadline again? Just to let them know.
28th of February.
Yes.
So 20th of February. Write your abstracts down, and you will have a great time if you are succeeded, of course. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Bye, everyone.
And that's a wrap up of this amazing late night talk with Bella, Alec, and Ella about their PhD research, experience, and thoughts in doing a PhD. Thank you all for having the time to listen to this first late night talk with PhDs of 2025. And make sure to follow their social media, to follow their work, or even to network with them if you're interested in ancient and contemporary histories. Also, 28th of February is the deadline for the upcoming Apocalypsis Nunc, Apocalypse and Calamity in the Ancient World Conference, which Alec and Bella have organized while liaising with their supervisors and fellow scholars at Swansea University. Submit your abstracts, and if you're selected to present your paper, you will not regret attending and presenting at this amazing conference, and to network with other academics and PhDs. I'll leave the link in the description. If you have enjoyed tuning in to this session and previous ones at the PhD Lounge podcast, thank you for leaving a review and a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify for Creators, and whichever podcast platform you're listening to. Visit also phdlounge.co.uk to check out all late night talks with other PhDs and follow my socials, Instagram at PhDLMF and LinkedIn. Last but not least, if you're a PhD, whether candidate or graduate, a postdoc or a scholar, and would love to be a guest to share your doctorate experience, send me an email at luisPhDlounge@gmail.com or my social media. Thank you all for tuning in. It has been a pleasure.